dear Lord. Guys, this is already my nth take already, and I can't take it anymore. But for you, I'm still going to record this tutorial about mixing and mastering in the context of podcast. Why do we have to mix and master podcasts in the first place? Say, for example, I already recorded such a great sounding vocal track, it can be a show of its own. Why do I still have to do mixing and mastering? So, there are a lot of reasons why you would do these things, and I want to cover some of them in this tutorial. So, basically, let's move back a bit, right? For my example earlier, we started with a great sounding recording. What if we started with a not so good sounding recording? What can mixing and mastering do for you? So this particular example track right here, this was recorded using my cell phone. So what I did was using my Wi-Fi and an application in my phone, I connected this to my PC and then my DAW and then recorded from there. Kind of like what I'm doing with this voiceover right now for the tutorial, right? But it sounds like this. So this is going to be a new podcast idea. So I'm just going to... Right. So it sounds nice, right? But it can sound like this. Wondering of the world. So this is going to be a new podcast idea. So I'm just going to simply ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes and then wrap it up. So it's not going to be that long. But since this is a pilot episode, I wanted to introduce myself first before we really get into the heart of the topic. So I am Kato Wanted to, with just a bit of preparation. So it sounds like it was recorded not through a cell phone. Like you can still hear it be clumsy at some parts, some moments here and there, but it just generally is easier to listen. The audience knows that you're doing a podcast, and the audience knows that a podcast will have a host. And so you as the host, if you wanted to create a podcast, you have to remember that this is recorded in not very ideal situations, whereas the content, the more popularly known content that you hear on a daily basis, were probably recorded in studios that were treated using the latest microphones, the latest equipment, and whatnot, right? But what you can take away from this is that through the process of mixing and mastering, whether by availing of it through a service or doing it yourself, you can actually get somewhere close to that level, right? Instead of just sounding plain and raw like this. The audience knows that you're doing a podcast, and the audience... Just with these few effects here, I can make it sound much better. The audience knows that you're doing a podcast, and the audience knows... That would be great already, right? And then you can maybe tweak it a bit more if you want. The audience knows that you're doing a podcast, and the audience knows that a podcast will have a host. And so you as the host, if you wanted to create a podcast, you don't really have to worry about what other people are going to say, because they understand that maybe if you're just starting out, that you're just starting out. Maybe if you've done this before, then you already have that sort of following, right? So how do you get from A to B? Well, you have to use some of the tools, and I want to introduce you to some of the tools that you might want to use whenever you're mixing and mastering. If you want to learn more about these tools in depth, because this is sort of meant to be an introduction, right? But if you want to learn about these tools in depth, there are a ton of other tutorials on YouTube, and if you want to get my insight about it, definitely let me know, and I'm gonna get straight to that. But moving back, so the first type of effect that you want to stumble upon, right, is what's called EQ, or equalization. Now, it's kind of a misnomer what an EQ is, but basically equalization is the act of changing the balance or changing the gain of certain frequencies in a certain track. So for example, in this vocal track, if I wanted the 8K frequency to be more prominent, I can increase this slightly. Ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes and then wrap it up. So it's not going to be that long. But since this is a pilot episode, I wanted to introduce myself So how would you use an EQ, or why would you use an EQ? Well, this is so that you can notch out, maybe there are resonances happening in your frequency, in a certain frequency that you don't like, or maybe say, for example, there's a harshness here, or it sounds
ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes and then wrap it up.
and you want to bring back the honkiness, because that doesn't sound nice, right? So you want to bring it,
Ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes and then
feel like there's dirt, so remove some of the dirt.
ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to
So
10
you can really go towards a particular direction just with the use of EQ. And there are a lot of other types of EQ. So this is a parametric EQ, right? But there's a ton of other EQs like this type right here. Oh, well, I'm not using this EQ currently, but this is how it sounds.
ramble on about a topic for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes and then wrap it up.
So, you know, it's very subtle, and because the key here is less is more. And a lot of the tools that you would use, I would say less is more is the principle to go by, right? And the next tool that you should get your hands on is a compressor, right? So a compressor basically is an automated volume control, but it's an automated volume control that happens in a very, very minuscule amount of time, in milliseconds. So this particular part of audio right here is around 15 milliseconds. This is how long that part is when you look at it with a big picture view, right? So it happens on a really tiny scale, and because of these changes, these dynamic changes that are happening in such a small time scale, right, it creates interesting effects. Say, for example, you want your vocals to be more upfront, a lot denser or fatter, or say you want more punch, like what you would want in a rap vocal. So those things are all possible. So here,
what's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators, they go
here's the vocal track without the compressor.
what's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators, they go ahead and
It's nice, but here's the track with the compressor.
what's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators, they go ahead and help you organize your podcast as well as distribute it to all podcast streaming platforms that there is, right? There are a ton of different services.
Right, so the reason why I turned this down is because I don't need it to be as high. So I just want to balance the attenuation that's happening here, shown on this meter, and I just want to balance it with my makeup gain. So again, I'm not going to go too in depth about these things, but again, if you want a tutorial about it, more in-depth tutorial, then definitely just let me know.
What's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators, they go ahead and help you organize your podcast as well as distribute it to all podcast streaming
Right. And then we have here what we call a de-esser. So a de-esser is basically, it's a dynamic EQ, or you can think about it like a compressor that only works on a certain frequency range, right? So that's what a de-esser does. And it's called a de-esser because the frequency ranges that the de-esser targets, that's where all of these S's, sh's, F's, and pops, that's where they exist, right? So here's it without the de-esser. So I'm going to turn off both de-essers.
What's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators,
You can really start hearing those S's become more prominent. And when I turn on both de-essers,
what's called aggregators, right? So these aggregators, they go ahead and help you organize your podcast.
it just softens up the S's so that they're not harsh, they're not razor blade sharp whenever somebody is listening back to your podcast. Okay. As a recap, there would be three primary reasons why the mixing and mastering process is important. One is, of course, to clean up your tracks, like what I just demonstrated before, right? But there's also the fact that you have to balance this track against other tracks. Say, for example, sound effects, the music, other vocal tracks or other guests in your podcast, you have to balance them against each other, and you would use practically the same tools that you use for those purposes, right? And then after you've cleaned it up, after you've edited it, placed things where they should be and whatnot, then that's the time wherein you would add flavor, enhancement, or just more juice out of your show. And that's about it for this really quick tutorial. I hope that gave you some insight into why the mixing and mastering process is important. Oh, no, we're not done yet, actually. We have one final thing. I just want to talk about this really quickly, right? So we also have mastering. And mastering is important because, say for example, the audio engineer or the mixing engineer has already balanced each track by itself, and then he's already made it sound good against other tracks inside the show. What needs to be done now is to take the final mix of that track and then make sure that it plays and translates consistently across all playback systems. And that's basically what this thing here does, or this mastering chain here does. And when you use mastering, you use just about the same tools, right? But again, if you want more in-depth about these things, just let me know what you want to learn, and then definitely we'll set up a tutorial about that. But once more, thank you so much for joining my first ever podcast tutorial. So just a little bit of an introduction. I will say that these videos will get better in the future soon as I, scale up my operations. Wow. But hopefully I see you again soon. Take care.